Gone Fishing by Deborah Fisher. Piers Longridge was used to being admired. When he reached his 60s, it had been galling to realize that others, both male and female, were no longer regularly gazing at him in adoration. He didn't understand it. His hair was grey now, certainly, but he still had more or less the same quantity as he'd had at 25, and he had kept himself in trim. There was no beer belly, no stiffness in the joints, not a lot in the way of wrinkles, thanks to a regular self-care regime. In short, nothing to put off a potential admirer. He had assumed that his partner, Keith, would always be there to care for his needs. They had been together for 40 years, and until recently Keith had remained faithful, a helpmeet, an indispensable appendage to the bachelor lifestyle Piers had continued to enjoy right up to the present day. There is no need for marriage, he had told Keith regularly. We don't need a piece of paper to keep us together. Recently, however, he had begun to have doubts. It had all begun in the spring when Keith went out to the US to visit family. Piers was well able to look after himself for a month, even 2 months, and was happy to hear that Keith was enjoying himself. For the first few weeks, they had met on Zoom at least 3 times a week. Soon, the average had fallen to once a week, or even once a fortnight, and still there was no sign of Keith booking his flight home. Much as it went against the grain to admit that he was missing Keith, Piers felt it was time to do something about the situation. James, who ran an antique shop in the vicinity of the flat shared by Piers and Keith, was a friend of both. Piers had met him at a social gathering some years earlier, and Keith, once he discovered the antique shop, was always in and out, looking for bargains. Not that James stocked anything cheap. On the contrary, if he saw Keith coming, he tended to raise the price to an off-putting amount. This was largely by arrangement with Piers, who was tired of having the place cluttered up with fake Grecian urns and jugs by Clarice Cliff. Such was Keith's appetite for home decor that they couldn't really afford. James seemed surprised to see Piers in this environment. It was a long time since he had visited the shop. "Hello, have you finally given in to Keith on that Tiffany lamp?" he asked hopefully. Business had rather tailed off recently, which possibly had something to do with the fact that James's assistant had resigned, and James himself tended to take days off whenever he pleased, without warning to potential customers. "You know me better than that," protested Piers. "No, I just wondered whether you'd heard from Keith at all." James looked bemused. "Haven't you? I thought he had only gone to the States for a few weeks. Actually, I thought he must be home by now." Piers looked glum. "I don't know what's going on, but I must admit I'm worried." "Sit down. I'll put the kettle on." Over a refreshing cup of Darjeeling, Piers poured out his concerns about Keith's apparent reluctance to come home and the growing suspicion that he might have found someone else. "Has he mentioned anyone?" "Well," Piers was embarrassed to admit it, but Keith had several times mentioned someone called Ned, whom he had met in a coffee shop. All he had told Piers was that Ned was a retired lecturer, but Piers had the sense that Keith was holding something back. James sighed. "I have to admit it does sound rather odd that he would fail to keep in touch like that. Has he mentioned any new friends he's made out there?" Piers hung his head. He didn't want James to see his face when he spoke. "He does seem to talk a lot about someone called Ned. Apparently he's an academic and—" "Did you say Ned? You can't mean Ned Larrabee." "I don't think he's mentioned a surname. Why, have you come across him?" "I'd need to Google. It's a long time, but it's possible. He was based in Princeton, and you said Keith was in New Jersey, didn't you?" For someone whose speciality was items more than 100 years old, James turned out to be pretty nifty at internet searches. He claimed that it was all to do with the necessity of participating in online auctions, but Piers suspected it could have more to do with online dating, or perhaps even online stalking. James went straight onto a site called LinkedIn. Before he gave up full-time work, colleagues had kept telling Piers he should get his professional profile on LinkedIn, but he couldn't be bothered. And now he was only teaching a couple of hours a week. It didn't seem worth the effort. James clearly knew his way around LinkedIn, and Piers wondered if he regularly looked up old boyfriends online. Here he is. Is this the one Keith spoke about? Piers pondered. I've never seen a photograph of him. I must say he's worn well, said James with a hint of admiration. I notice he's not at Princeton anymore, probably been kicked out. He calls himself a professor, but of course that means something different in America. Does it? Asked Piers weakly, aware of his own comparative ignorance. Typical of Ned. Will you look at these testimonials? I imagine he's paid former students to write them. Piers had to admit that the endorsements of Ned's skills sounded rather gushing. Suddenly he felt tears prick at his eyes. I've lost him, he said. I've lost Keith. Don't be ridiculous. We'll fix this. We just need to think of a ploy. Before long, James had come up with a scheme. Piers didn't understand much of what he was trying to explain, but he went along with it. It was a relief to be doing something. James seemed to be rather enjoying himself as he worked out what he called a strategy, which he planned to put into action immediately. Piers watched, bemused, as he set up a fake LinkedIn identity as an independent researcher at Oxford, wanting to make contact with his American counterpart. He nearly fainted when he saw the photograph that went with it. But that's not you, he protested. It is actually. It's what I looked like 40 years ago. Piers looked from the image to James and back again. Or perhaps a little more, he thought. What will he think when he recognizes you? He won't. Ned changed partners more often than he changed his. Piers held up a hand. He didn't want to hear any more. A few days later, Keith phoned to say he was coming home. He was missing Piers and couldn't wait to be back with him. Piers was forced to admit that he felt exactly the same. They were reunited at Heathrow. Piers felt a surge of affection as he saw him in the crowd coming out of the arrivals gate, his sweet little face looking pinched and white. Oh, Keith, dear, he exclaimed as they embraced. How wonderful to be with you again in person. On the journey home, Keith seemed subdued, not quite his normal garrulous self, and Piers thought he knew why. After helping him take his bags upstairs, he insisted that Keith sit down and rest. As they settled back into the kitchen and were enjoying a cup of tea, Piers chucked him under the chin. Cheer up, old friend. I know you've been having a wonderful time with your American pals, but you'll see them again. Perhaps we'll go together next time. Oh, Piers, Keith burst into tears. You don't know the half of it. I've been so silly. Then it all came pouring out. How Keith had met a handsome academic who had seduced him and then, as Keith put it, cast him aside like an old glove when a better offer came along. I wasn't unfaithful to you, Keith insisted. Truly I wasn't. But I was tempted, Piers. I was tempted. He was so attentive, so persuasive. I was on the verge of don't say any more. Though it hurt him to hear the confession, Piers was prepared. He had already forgiven Keith, and in any case, Keith had been punished enough. All he wanted now was for things to be as they had been before the visit to New Jersey, or rather, better than they had been. He, Piers, would turn over a new leaf. He would be kinder, more thoughtful. He would bring home flowers and perhaps even help with the dusting, and he had already put a deposit on that Tiffany lamp Keith had so coveted. James telephoned that evening to see how things were. "What will Ned say when you meet him at the airport, do you think?" asked Piers. He had no idea that Ned was, at that very moment, standing outside Terminal 5, looking around in vain for the car and driver that had been promised. When he became anxious and rang the mobile number James had given him, he would find it didn't exist. He would probably get the train to Oxford and discover that the home address he had been given was also a fake. And no one at the Bodleian would ever have heard of Connor O'Connor.